was a strict interpretation of current law.
Senator Bennet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Mr. Mnuchin, it's nice to see you again. Thank you for your service. This year we're working on a farm bill. Chairman Roberts and Ranking Member Stabenow are both members of this committee, and they're working hard within very tight budget constraints to write the next farm bill. I noticed that your budget cuts $260 billion from farm bill spending on top of a 15% cut in discretionary spending for USDA. And I'm all for finding savings. In fact, the Ag Committee, you may not know this, was the only committee that actually got bipartisan savings in the last budget process. The last farm bill was projected to save $23 billion. Only committee that did its work. CBO now tells us that that bipartisan work on behalf and fueled by our farmers and ranchers is now saving $100 billion. Now, many of Colorado's farmers and ranchers are struggling with low prices, facing persistent drought, and are fighting hard every day to keep their operations moving. I'd like you to tell those farmers and ranchers about the proposed cuts when these guys have already, unlike anybody else, actually did their work last time. How are these proposed cuts going to help them?
Well, again, I'm not the expert on the farm area, but it's an important part of the economy, and I look forward to working with you on these issues.
Well, but could you elaborate on how the cuts are going to affect our farmers and ranchers, particularly at these commodity prices?
Again, there were difficult decisions made in the budget, and obviously as it relates to farmers, this is something that it would have some impact. And again, look forward to following up. And
I know from at least my perspective, and I hope speaking both for Republicans and Democrats on the Ag Committee, it really adds insult to injury when we did our work the last time to see farmers and ranchers, especially in this commodity environment, getting whacked. And by the way, I don't think you guys have made hard choices. Giving $37 billion to 572,000 taxpayers that make more than $1 million a year by borrowing that money from our kids is not a hard choice. And now you're having to backfill already just a month later, Mr. Secretary. Do you know what the deficit was when Bill Clinton left the presidency?
I do, and because of the economic growth during that period of time, we saw revenues increase significantly, and since that period of time, the deficits have increased significantly.
What was the deficit when Bill Clinton left the White House?
Well, we were actually, during that period of time, paying down.
We had a surplus, didn't we?
That is correct.
It was a $5 trillion surplus projected over a decade, isn't that correct?
I don't know what it was over the decade, but I do know we were paying.
That's what it was, and we were holding hearings about what to do with the surplus. Do you know what the deficit was when President Obama became president?
I have the numbers with me.
It was about 1.2 trillion. It became 1.5 trillion. And I saw Jack Lew, who was here, your predecessor, and Secretary Geithner, beaten to death by members of this committee over the recession, over the deficit during the worst recession since the Great Depression. I have statement after statement after statement of Republican colleagues who were unwilling to lift a finger when we had a 10% unemployment rate, beating those guys to death as they sat here. And now we passed $1.5 trillion tax cut. We borrowed all that money from our kids. Last week, the President signed a spending bill like we've never seen before. And so the estimates now are that even in an economy where we're seeing tremendous growth, we're going to have a $1 trillion deficit next year and maybe as much as $2 trillion over 10 years. I mean, how can you look yourself in the mirror?
Well, again, let me just first say I share your concerns over the deficit, and that's why I think it's important on a bipartisan basis we work on this. We've put together a budget that shrinks the deficit, but the President is concerned that the debt went from $10 to $20 trillion.
And we're on track. And that was when we had a recession, Mr. Secretary. That was when we had a recession. We will have a recession. We may have an armed conflict of some kind. And the idea that we're now spending the money instead of trying to figure out how to work in a bipartisan way to do the work. And Mr. Secretary, I mean, the assumptions that underlie your budget save $675 billion by repealing the Affordable Care Act. The majority leader has already told us we're not doing that. They attempted to repeal it over and over and over again. The majority leader says we're not doing that. That's $675 billion. You save $1.5 trillion by slashing non-defense discretionary spending to a level we have not seen since President Hoover was the president.
Senator, your time has expired.
I look forward to trying to create a rational process here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Wyden has a couple of questions, then we're going to wrap this up.
Thank you. I think Senator McCaskill may have a couple of ones up.
You do?
Okay.
Okay. Senator Wyden,
All right.
he'll be the last one.
I want to talk about infrastructure for a moment, Mr. Secretary. State and local governments now are responsible for more than 3/4 of all government investment in infrastructure. Despite